Hesen doesn't know me or remember me, as my daughter's birth 4 years ago was quick and uncomplicated. I didn't know she was Palestinian until NYU fired her last week for speaking and posting about the genocide in Palestine. I am volunteering to speak because Hesen provided me and my family with heartfelt care, and also to share my experience as a person of Lebanese heritage who has worked at NYU since 2015. I'll start with the caveat that my stress and anguish over abuses of the Israeli occupation has been lifelong, beginning way before October 7. Following the atrocities on October 7, all NYU employees received an email from NYU Langone leadership condemning Hamas and expressing outrage and grief for the 1,200 plus murdered Israelis and hostages. The email from leadership made no mention of Palestinian people or of Gaza whatsoever. Thousands of Palestinian civilians had been bombed, killed, and maimed. Hundreds of children had already been killed. 1.2 million Palestinians were displaced overnight and were now homeless refugees. Despite this immense destruction, the loss of thousands of Palestinian lives in October didn't evoke mention or condolences from NYU Langone, from leadership or otherwise, as they had extended to Ukrainian employees the year prior. The next communication from NYU Langone leadership to all NYU providers outlined the possibility of sending a contingent of volunteer physicians to Israel. They let us know that NYU had consulted with the Israeli Ministry of Health and had determined Israel did not, in fact, have a need for volunteer physicians at this time, and so the hospital would not be sending any. The email also let us know that NYU Langone had already made a large donation of medical supplies to Israeli hospitals. Again, there was no mention of Palestinians, no mention of Gaza, and no mention of the collapsed healthcare system in Gaza. Now I think it's wonderful if the hospital sends volunteer providers and medical equipment to anyone in need, be it to hospitals in Israel or to any other country. However, to not mention the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza that was happening in real time, and the Palestinian doctors, nurses, and EMTs who were killed was a glaring omission. Please recall that at the exact time this communication from leadership was sent, we were all following the daily horror of Al-Shifa Hospital. We woke up each morning to Instagram reels of dead and injured children in Al-Shifa, and to the Palestinian doctors and nurses recording their efforts to save people pulled from the rubble. These doctors and nurses clearly stated that they lacked basic medicines and equipment needed to save the lives of the men, women, children, and the babies pulled from the rubble. Sorry, it's a little emotional just reading this even. They also repeatedly mentioned not having sufficient food and water for themselves, let alone for their patients.
Take your time. Take a moment.
These were terrible images we will never be able to get out of our minds. This documentation is widely available on social media and all translated into English, so there's no excuse to pretend this wasn't happening. Perhaps it was insensitivity on the part of leaderships, perhaps outright denial, but for me as an employee, this omission erased Palestinians completely. A mere acknowledgement, condolences for the Palestinian lives lost in Gaza, and mention of Palestinian doctors, nurses, and EMTs would have sufficed. Next, I'd like to mention how official communications to NYU employees responding to our emotional needs following October 7th fell short for Palestinian and Arab employees. We received one email offering mental health support to those, quote, to those affected by the crisis in Israel and Palestine, unquote, which was generic but good enough. We then received emails about hospital initiatives to combat anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and further ones offering spiritual and emotional support to Jewish and Muslim employees. While these resources were welcomed and are much needed by Jewish and Muslim employees, they fell short for Palestinian employees. These well-meaning initiatives didn't acknowledge the existence, let alone the suffering, of Christian Palestinians. These official emails didn't acknowledge the anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian violence in the U.S. since October 7th, such as the 3 Palestinian college students shot in Vermont while wearing keffiyehs. Most hurtful of all, these emails reinforced to all hospital employees the Zionist narrative that this is at core a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews. She emphasizes that this is not a religious conflict. These official en masse communications from NYU Langone leadership to all NYU employees erase Palestinians' existence and suffering. Palestinians as an ethnic group and Gaza as a place were never mentioned. This tone set from the top is why Hesen was retaliated against for expressing her political views and grief for her people. Did Hesen's political views make some uncomfortable? I've been uncomfortable at work for a long time. I once had my boss at NYU openly laud an Israeli, quote, hero of the 6-day war, unquote, during a routine meeting. Coworkers have openly expressed admiration for the IOF or casually shared their experiences of their, quote, unquote, birthright trips to Israel. There is nothing wrong with sharing their experiences and opinions. It simply hurts because I never felt free to openly talk about Palestinian, Lebanese, or Arab identity at work. I always extended these coworkers grace because I knew that they simply did not have the exposure to Palestinians that I had. They didn't know the stories of my Palestinian American friends and cousins who have been barred from ever visiting the villages of their parents or grandparents on account of their ethnicity. They would never have heard a story like that of my cousin, a Palestinian American documentary filmmaker who had her film footage confiscated by Israeli authorities and was subsequently deported as she was deemed, quote unquote, a security threat. There's my Palestinian American friend deported from Israel and the West Bank while working at Birzeit University after the Israeli government deemed her, quote unquote, a security concern. And she was unable to continue her dream of working in Palestinian higher education. A Lebanese American family friend, unable to grow a business in East Jerusalem as the apartheid prevented his business from flourishing. My cousin, whose home was confiscated in Haifa in 1948, and he was never allowed to return. Friends' parents expelled from their homes and villages in the West Bank in 1967. The grotesque routine human rights violations that Palestinians in the occupied territories endure. My point is, when my coworkers freely expressed political views and life experiences that ran counter to my own, I indeed felt uncomfortable, but nevertheless responded by extending grace and workplace camaraderie. To the labor and delivery unit at NYU Langone, you had the courage, the summer George Floyd was murdered, to take a moral stand and unequivocally let your patients know that Black moms matter. You had providers wear this message on their clothing to let Black mothers know they would not be overlooked. To NYU Langone, you invited NYU employees to kneel outdoors in 9 minutes of silence to honor George Floyd and to institutionally acknowledge that systemic racism against Black Americans is real and rampant. You began diversity initiatives in an ambitious effort to encourage us, your employees, to reflect on biases to the workplace and to the care we provide our patients. You encouraged units and departments to self-reflect when it comes to race and to be open to feedback from our colleagues of color to expand our awareness and shine light on our inevitable blind spots. In firing Hesen, you showed us that NYU Langone's DEI initiatives don't apply to Palestinians. To correct this harm, you need to allow your employees to express their views about Palestine. You need to mention Palestinians as an ethnic group and Gaza as a place. Reinstate Hesen and allow her to continue or leave on her own terms. Do you have the courage to allow your Palestinian employees to express grief? Do you have the moral compass to acknowledge that Palestinian suffering exists?